The gate was locked, so Grace climbed it. Her boots hit the gravel on the other side, and the sound cracked through the quiet morning air, like a small warning shot. She had been away from this land for 11 years. 11 years, and the gravel still crunched the exact same way under her feet, as if the ground itself remembered her. She did not get far. A man on a gray horse came around the bend of the old oak trees, moving fast, his coat snapping behind him. He pulled the horse up hard when he saw her, dust rising around the hooves. "You," he said, "do you know whose land this is?" Grace looked up at him. He was tall, even sitting down, dressed like something out of an old photograph, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that came from never once in his life being told no. "I know exactly whose land this is," she said. "Then you know you are trespassing." He swung down off the horse, boots landing hard on the gravel. "I am Edward Ashcombe. This is my family's estate. I could have you removed within the hour." Grace reached into her bag. Her fingers found the folder she had carried through 3 countries and 11 years of waiting. She held it out to him without a word. He did not take it right away. He looked at her face instead, searching for something, a memory maybe, a name he could not quite place. Then he looked at the folder like it might bite him. "What is this?" "Paperwork," Grace said. "Read it. Then we can talk about who is trespassing." He opened it. His eyes moved fast down the page, then slower, then back up to the top, like he thought he had misread something. His jaw worked, but no sound came out. Somewhere behind him, a bird called out twice and stopped. "This is not possible," he said finally. "It's very possible. It's notarized. It's filed with the county. It's real. This is my family's land. It has been Ashcombe land for 200 years. It was Voss land before that," Grace said. "For longer." His head came up sharp at the name, Voss. She watched it land on him, watched him search his memory and find something small and buried, a story his grandfather used to tell about a family that lost everything in an auction that was never quite honest. "Voss," he repeated. "You're not." "Grace Voss," she said. "My father was Henry Voss. Maybe you've heard the name in a story your family liked to leave out the important parts of." The horse shifted, impatient, tail flicking at nothing. Edward closed the folder slowly, like closing it might make the words inside stop being true. "You cannot simply walk onto my land and tell me you own it." "I'm not telling you," Grace said. "The county already told you. I'm just the one standing in front of you when you find out." For a moment he said nothing. He looked past her, down the long stretch of green that rolled toward the house in the distance, its stone the color of old bone in the morning light. Grace did not follow his eyes there. She kept looking at his face, because his face was easier to read than the house was, and because looking at the house too long made something rise in her chest that she did not want rising yet. Not here, not in front of him. "I want my solicitor to see this," he said. "Good. Send him the copy. I have 3. "You've been planning this." "For 11 years, Grace said. "You get very good at planning something when it's the only thing keeping you upright some nights." She did not know why she said it. It was more than she meant to give him. His eyes narrowed slightly, like he had caught a piece of something he was not supposed to see, and she wished she could take the words back and swallow them whole. "I don't know what you think you're going to do with an estate like this," he said. "It is not a business card. It is not a trophy. It is people's homes. It is tenants who depend on the way this land runs." "I'm aware," Grace said. "I grew up hearing every detail of how this land runs. My father told me bedtime stories about the orchard on the east side and the well near the old chapel that never runs dry even in summer. He never got to see it again after they took it from him. So don't tell me what this land means. I could probably draw you a map of it with my eyes closed." Edward went quiet at that. The horse stamped once. Somewhere far off, a dog barked twice and went silent, as if even the animals on the property could feel that something had shifted in the air. "What was taken from your father," he said slowly, "was taken before I was born. I know. So what is it you want from me?" Grace looked at him for a long moment. She had rehearsed this exact question in her head so many times, on so many nights, that she almost forgot she had never spoken the answer out loud before. "I don't want anything from you," she said. "I already have what I came for." She turned and started walking down the long drive toward the house, her boots crunching that same familiar gravel, her back straight, her hands steady even though her heart was doing something loud and complicated in her chest. Behind her she heard him call out, "You can't just walk in there." "Watch me," she said without turning around. She heard the horse's hooves start moving again, faster this time, catching up to her. He fell into step beside her, leading the animal by its reins, his face still tight with the kind of disbelief that had nowhere left to go. "At least tell me how," he said. "How does a stranger simply produce papers and take an estate that has been in one family for 2 centuries? "I'm not a stranger," Grace said. "That's the part you're missing. I used to live in that house. I used to run down this exact drive when I was 7 years old, before your family's lawyers found a way to make my father sign something he did not understand, in a language that was not his first, during a year when he had just buried his own father and could barely hold a pen straight." Edward's steps slowed. Grace kept walking. "I don't expect you to feel sorry for that," she said. "I'm not here for sympathy. I'm here because the paperwork was wrong from the beginning, and it took 11 years and every bit of money I had to prove it, and now it's proven, and now it's mine." They reached the front steps of the house. Up close, the stone was even more the color of bone, cool and pale, with ivy creeping along one side like it had been trying to claim the building for itself. Grace stopped at the bottom step and looked up at the door, the same heavy oak door she remembered from childhood, the brass handle worn smooth by 100 years of hands. She reached out and touched the handle. It was warmer than she expected. "That door does not open for you," Edward said behind her, though his voice had lost some of its certainty now. "It will," Grace said. "Give it time." She did not go in, not yet. She let her hand rest on the handle a moment longer, feeling the small vibration of it under her palm, some trick of the old wood settling in the morning heat. Then she stepped back, turned, and looked at Edward properly for the first time since she had climbed that gate. He was younger than she expected, younger than the stories she had built up in her head, younger than the man she had imagined confronting for over a decade. There was something almost boyish in the way his jaw kept tightening and releasing, like a person trying very hard to hold a shape they were not built to hold. "I'll be back tomorrow," Grace said, "with my solicitor. We'll discuss transition. Tenants stay, staff stay. Nothing changes for them. What changes is whose name is on the deed, and that has already changed, whether either of us likes the shape of it. And if I contest it, then you'll lose," Grace said, "the same way my father lost. Except this time, the paperwork is clean, and this time I have 11 years of receipts to prove exactly how dirty yours was." She turned to go back down the drive. She had not gone 3 steps when he spoke again, quieter this time, almost to himself. "Voss," he said, "I remember now. There's a photograph in the East Hall, a little girl on a pony, by the old well." Grace stopped walking. "That's me," she said, without turning around. "I always wondered who she was," Edward said. "Nobody in the family would tell me. Now you know." She kept walking, and this time he let her go, standing there at the bottom of his own front steps, with a folder in his hand that had just quietly rearranged the entire shape of his life, watching a stranger, who was not really a stranger, disappear down the long gravel drive with the sun climbing higher behind her, throwing her shadow long and steady across the land that used to belong to her family, and now, again, did. She did not look back at the house until she reached the gate. When she did, she found her chest tight in a way she had not let herself feel yet, not once in 11 years of fighting for this moment. She had pictured 100 versions of walking back onto Ashcombe land. In none of them had she pictured the strange, hollow ache of getting exactly what she wanted, and discovering it did not feel like winning. She climbed back over the locked gate, because some habits from childhood never really leave a person, and stood on the outside of it for a moment, looking in at the house, at the ivy, at the man still standing on the steps watching her. Tomorrow she would come back with lawyers and papers and everything official. Today she just wanted to remember what it felt like to stand this close to home again, and to know, for the first time in over a decade, that nobody could tell her to leave. The solicitor's office smelled like old paper and stronger coffee than Grace usually allowed herself. She sat across the table from 3 men in dark suits, all of them representing Edward Ashcombe, all of them with the same tight expression of people who had been told to find a hole in something and could not find one. "The 1974 transfer document," one of them said, tapping a page. "We believe there may be irregularities in how your firm obtained the original auction records." "You're welcome to check," Grace said. "I already did. 3 times, with 3 separate archivists in 2 different countries. The auction that took my father's land was rigged. The buyer bidding against him did not exist. He was a name invented by the auctioneer to drive up the price and then quietly withdrawn once my father, grieving and desperate, signed papers he did not fully understand. That is a serious accusation." "It is a proven one," Grace said, and slid a second folder across the table. Bank records showing the phantom buyer's account was opened and closed within the same week. Signed statements from 2 surviving witnesses who worked the auction that year. A forensic document examiner's report on the signature page, showing it does not match my father's hand in 3 separate places. The room went quiet. One of the lawyers reached for the folder like it might be hot. Edward sat at the end of the table, arms crossed, saying nothing. He had said almost nothing since they walked in. Grace had noticed him watching her more than watching the papers, like the papers were simply confirmation of a thing he had already decided to believe the moment he read her name. "Even if all this is true," the second lawyer said, "the estate has been under Ashcombe management for over 50 years. There is a question of adverse possession, of established use." "Which does not apply when the original transfer was fraudulent," Grace said. "You cannot build a legal right on top of a crime and call it settled, just because enough time passed for everyone to get comfortable with the crime." Edward finally spoke. "Enough." The lawyers turned to him, surprised. "She's right," he said. "I had my own solicitor review this last night. Independently, he came to the same conclusion your firm did, Miss Voss. The transfer was compromised." One of his lawyers started to object. Edward held up a hand and the man stopped. "I don't like this," Edward said, looking at Grace now. "I don't like waking up and discovering that the house I was born in was never rightfully my family's to give me. But I am not going to sit here and pretend a forged signature is a foundation I want to keep standing on." Grace had not expected that. She had come prepared for a fight that could stretch another 11 years, another decade of appeals and delays and men in suits finding technical reasons to slow down what she already knew was true. She had not prepared for a man simply agreeing with her in a room full of people paid to disagree. "Thank you," she said, and it came out quieter than she meant it to. "Don't thank me," Edward said. "I'm not doing you a favor. I'm doing the only thing that makes sense once you've seen what I saw last night." The meeting stretched 2 more hours. Terms were discussed. Tenants would keep their leases. Staff would keep their positions under new ownership. A transition period was proposed, 90 days, during which the transfer of records, accounts, and responsibilities would happen in careful stages so that nothing on the estate collapsed under the weight of sudden change. Grace agreed to all of it. She had not come to burn anything down. She had come to take back what was hers, and to make sure nobody who depended on that land for their living got hurt in the process. Her father had taught her that too, in the years before he died, in the small rented flat 2 counties away, where he used to talk about Ashcombe in his sleep, like it was still his to dream about. When the meeting ended, the lawyers filed out first, murmuring to each other in low voices. Edward stayed behind, gathering papers slowly, in no particular hurry. "You knew all of this before you ever climbed that gate," he said, once they were alone. "I knew the facts," Grace said. "I didn't know how you would react to them." "How did you expect me to react?" "Worse," Grace admitted. "I expected years of fighting. I expected you to hire people whose only job was to make this take so long I gave up." "My family has done worse things than that," Edward said, and something in his voice went flat and tired when he said it. "I'm aware of our history, Miss Voss. I did not grow up ignorant of the fact that some of what we had came at other people's expense. I simply did not know your family's name attached to a specific loss until yesterday morning." Grace studied him. There was no performance in the way he said it, no attempt to look good in front of her. Just a kind of plain, uncomfortable honesty that she had not expected from a man raised inside walls, built on someone else's ruin. "My father used to talk about the orchard," she said, before she could stop herself. "The East Orchard, with the old apple trees his grandfather planted. He never got to see it again. He died still describing it to me like it was something that belonged to him in a place nobody could ever take him back to." "The orchard is still there," Edward said, "though I confess it hasn't been well kept. There was a bad frost 2 winters back, and half the trees never quite recovered." "I'd like to see it," Grace said, "before we finalize anything. I'd like to walk it." "I'll take you," Edward said, and then seemed to catch himself, as if he had offered something he was not sure he had the right to offer anymore. "If that's welcome, it is your land now, after all. You don't need my permission to walk your own orchard." "No," Grace agreed, "but it would be strange to walk it alone the first time, after everything." He nodded slowly, like he understood something about that sentence that went deeper than the words themselves. They left the solicitor's office together and drove out to the estate in near silence, the countryside rolling by in long green stretches, hedgerows and stone walls marking boundaries that Grace realized now had never really meant what everyone assumed they meant. Boundaries could be redrawn. Ownership could shift under a person's feet without them ever noticing the ground moving. The orchard sat at the eastern edge of the property, past the old chapel, past the well her father used to describe as never running dry even in the hottest summers. Grace walked between the rows slowly, her hand trailing along rough bark, some trees healthy and heavy with early fruit, others bare and gray, victims of that bad frost Edward had mentioned. "This one," she said, stopping at a tree near the center of the row. "My father said his grandfather planted this exact tree the year he was born, said you could always find it, because it grew a little crooked, leaning toward the well, like it was trying to drink from it." She looked up. The tree in front of her leaned, slightly, toward the well in the distance. Edward stood a few feet away, watching her rather than the tree. "You really did grow up on stories about this place," he said. "It's the only inheritance my father had left to give me," Grace said. "Stories. He couldn't leave me the land, so he gave me every detail of it instead, over and over, until I knew it better than places I'd actually lived. I used to think it was sad. Now I think maybe it was the smartest thing he ever did, because I walked in here yesterday and I already knew this orchard. I already knew the well never runs dry. I already knew which shelf in the library held his favorite book, if it's still there." "It's still there," Edward said quietly. "The library hasn't changed much in decades. Nobody in my family reads as much as they should." Grace laughed, short and surprised, the first real laugh she had let out since arriving. It startled her almost as much as it seemed to startle him. "I'd like to see the library too," she said, "before we finalize anything." "Of course," Edward said. "It's your library now." They stood there a moment longer, between the crooked tree and the well, the morning light falling soft and gold across the orchard, and for the first time since Grace had climbed that locked gate, the ache in her chest eased into something she did not immediately have a name for. Not quite peace, not yet, but something closer to it than she had felt in 11 long years. Later that afternoon, walking back from the orchard, Edward took her a different way, past a row of small stone cottages set along the eastern boundary of the estate. Washing lines stretched between 2 of them, shirts and towels drying in the breeze, and an older man sat on a bench outside the nearest door, whittling something small out of a piece of pale wood. "That's Peter," Edward said quietly. "He's worked this land almost 50 years. His father worked it before him." The old man looked up as they approached, his eyes narrowing slightly at the sight of Grace, then widening in a way that made her stomach tighten with a nervousness she had not expected to feel over meeting a stranger. "You're the Voss girl," he said, echoing the words Grace was starting to hear, so often they had begun to feel like a title rather than a fact. "I knew your grandfather. Fine man. Terrible thing. What happened to your father after him?" "You remember that far back," Grace said. "I remember everything about this land," Peter said, setting his whittling knife down carefully. "Comes with staying in one place long enough. I watched your grandfather teach your father how to graft new branches onto that old orchard, back before either of us understood what was coming for this family." Grace sat down slowly on the low stone wall across from his bench, and for the next half hour she listened to a version of her own history she had never heard before, delivered by a man who had lived beside it his entire life, while she had only ever received fragments of it second-hand, softened and shaped by grief before it ever reached her. Edward stood back and let the conversation happen without him, watching Grace's face change slowly as pieces of her father's early life were handed to her, unhurried, by someone who had simply been waiting all these years for the right person to finally ask. When they finally walked on, the sun beginning to lower over the western fields, Grace found herself quieter than before, carrying something new and heavy and good. "Thank you," she said to Edward, "for taking me that way." "I didn't do much," Edward said. "I only walked beside you." That was enough, Grace said, and meant it more than she expected to. The library at Ashcombe took up the entire west wing, 2 stories of dark wood shelving with a spiral staircase connecting them, and a smell of leather and dust that hit Grace the moment Edward pushed open the double doors. She stood in the doorway a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the dimmer light, letting the smell settle into her memory beside all the other things her father had described to her that she was only now getting to see with her own eyes. "Everyone says that," Edward said. "Photographs always make it look bigger somehow." Grace walked in slowly, her fingers trailing along the spines of books she did not recognize, some of them older than the country itself, their titles worn illegible by decades of handling. She was looking for one book in particular, though she had not told Edward that yet, had not told anyone in years, because it felt like the kind of thing that could break if she said it out loud too early. "There's a book," she said finally, "a collection of poems. My father said it belonged to his mother, and that it stayed in this library even after everything else was taken, because nobody thought to steal a book nobody in your family would ever read." Edward's eyebrows lifted slightly at that, though he did not argue the insult buried in it. "Do you know the title?" "He never told me the exact title, just that it had a green cover, and that it sat on the 3rd shelf from the top, in the corner near the window that looks out over the drive, because his mother liked to read there in the afternoon light." Edward turned and looked toward the corner window without a word, the exact one Grace had already pictured before he moved, and something passed over his face that looked almost like disbelief, mixed with something gentler underneath it. "How do you know this house better than I do?" he said, not quite a question. Grace did not answer. She walked toward the corner instead, drawn by something she could not fully explain, some old pull in her chest that had nothing to do with facts or paperwork or 11 years of legal fighting. She climbed 3 rungs of the small rolling ladder built into the shelves and reached up to the 3rd shelf from the top. Her fingers found a green spine before her eyes did. She pulled the book down carefully, dust sliding off the top edge in a thin gray curtain, and held it in both hands like it might dissolve if she gripped it too hard. The cover was faded, the gold lettering of the title worn almost smooth, but still legible if she tilted it toward the window light. Edward stood below her, very still, watching. "That's it," he said quietly. "That's the exact one, isn't it?" Grace did not answer right away. She opened the cover instead, and found, in careful looping handwriting on the inside page, a name that was not hers, a name that belonged to a woman who had died decades before Grace was even born, a woman whose blood ran in her own veins, whether the deed to this house said so or not. Something in her chest gave way, quiet and sudden, like a floor giving under weight it had held for years without complaint. She climbed down from the ladder slowly, the book held against her chest, and did not look up at Edward right away because she did not trust her own face in that moment. He waited. He did not fill the silence with anything, did not ask if she was all right, did not do any of the small polite things people usually did when someone in front of them went quiet, in a way that suggested something large moving underneath. "My father used to describe this exact moment," Grace said finally, her voice lower than she meant it to be. "Standing in this corner, finding this book. He never got to do it himself. He died still talking about it, like it was something he'd get to someday, and someday never came for him." She looked up then, and found Edward watching her with an expression she could not immediately place. Something careful and unguarded at the same time, like a man trying very hard not to make a private moment feel observed. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what it's worth. I know it isn't worth much, coming from me." "It's worth something," Grace said, surprising herself again. "More than I expected it to be, anyway." She set the book down on a nearby reading table, running her hand flat against the cover as if to steady it, or steady herself. She was not entirely sure which. Edward moved a few steps closer, close enough that she could feel the shift in the air between them, though he stopped short of anything that could be called crossing a line. "You said your father talked about this place in his sleep," Edward said, "near the end." "Every night," Grace said. "The nurses used to ask me about it, toward the end, because he'd wake up disoriented and start describing rooms that did not exist in the hospital he was in. The orchard, the well, this library. I used to sit there and write down everything he said, because I thought maybe someday it would matter. Maybe someday I'd need to know exactly which shelf, exactly which corner, exactly which tree. And now you do." "Now I do," Grace agreed, "which makes it feel like I spent 11 years preparing for a test I already knew every answer to, except the test turned out to be a lot heavier than I expected once I finally got here to take it." Edward was quiet for a moment, looking at the book on the table between them rather than at her. "I used to hate this library growing up," he said. "Not the books. The house wanted me in here for hours every day. Tutors, lessons, expectations about what an Ashcombe was supposed to know by a certain age. I used to sneak out that window there, the low one, and spend whole afternoons in the orchard instead, which I now realize was your orchard the entire time, even then." "Small world," Grace said, and there was no bitterness in it, just a strange, tired sort of humor that surprised her by how easily it came. "I suppose it is," Edward said, "or a small piece of land, anyway, that keeps insisting two families share more history than either of them wanted to admit." Grace looked at him properly then. Really looked, the way she had avoided doing since the gate, since the horse, since the moment he had called her a trespasser, with such total confidence that she was tempted, briefly, to believe him herself. He was not what she had built up in her head over 11 years of imagining this confrontation. She had pictured someone cold, someone entitled in the way that comes from never once questioning what you were given. Instead, she found a man standing in his own library, looking almost lost, holding the weight of a history he had not chosen but could not walk away from either. "Why did you agree so quickly?" she asked. "Yesterday. In the solicitor's office. You could have fought this for years. Plenty of families would have." Edward considered the question longer than she expected before he answered. "Because I looked at the documents your team prepared, and then I looked at you standing in that room, and I understood something all at once. That fighting you would mean spending years defending a lie I had never even chosen to tell. My grandfather told it. My great-grandfather profited from it, and somewhere along the way, my family simply decided it was easier to enjoy the house than to ask hard questions about how we came to have it." "That's a more honest answer than I expected," Grace said. "I'm trying," Edward said, "to be a more honest man than the ones who came before me. I don't know if I'll manage it, but I'd like to start somewhere, and this seemed as good a place as any." Grace picked the book back up, holding it a little more easily now, the initial shock of finding it settling into something steadier, something closer to gratitude than grief. Edward pulled 2 chairs closer to the reading table, and for a while neither of them spoke, the quiet of the library settling around them like something old and familiar. Grace turned the pages of the book carefully, the poems inside written in a hand as looping and confident as the signature on the first page, and found herself reading a few lines under her breath before she caught herself doing it. "Read one to me," Edward said, "if you don't mind. I'd like to hear how it sounds, coming from someone who actually understands what this book means." Grace hesitated, then found a short poem near the middle of the collection, about an orchard in late summer, about fruit falling before anyone thought to catch it, about roots that held on long after the rest of the tree had given up remembering why. She read it slowly, her voice steadier than she expected, and when she finished, the room felt different somehow, fuller, like the words had been waiting 100 years for someone to finally say them out loud in the exact room they were written about. "She was writing about this orchard," Edward said quietly. "Wasn't she? The one we walked through this morning." "I think so," Grace said. "The falling fruit, the roots holding on. It sounds like she knew something about this land that neither of our families managed to hold on to afterward." "Maybe that's what happens to land like this," Edward said. "It keeps its own memory, whether or not the people living on it deserve to keep theirs." Grace closed the book gently, her hand resting on the faded cover, and looked around the library properly for the first time since they had entered, taking in the shelves stretching up into shadow, the spiral staircase, the low window Edward had once climbed out of as a boy escaping lessons he did not want to learn. "I used to imagine this room," she said, "not just the shelf, or the corner, or the window, the whole room, exactly as it is now, dust and all. I used to lie awake as a girl building it piece by piece out of whatever my father described that night, like I was constructing it from memory before I ever had the chance to actually remember it myself. And now that you're standing in it, it's better than I imagined," Grace said, "which almost never happens. Usually the real version of something disappoints you after you've built it up too much in your head. This one didn't." Edward looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable and careful behind his expression, and Grace found she did not look away first, the way she might have with anyone else, the way 11 years of guarding herself had taught her to do with almost everyone she met. "I should tell you something," he said finally. "I've spent most of my life being told this house, this library, this land, would all be mine someday, and I never once felt like any of it truly belonged to me. Not the way you're describing it belonging to you. Even now, even before the paperwork is finished. I think I always sensed, somewhere underneath everything, that something about the way I held this place was wrong. I just never had proof of it until you climbed that gate." Grace did not know what to say to that. She held the book a little tighter instead, feeling the weight of it, the small proof that some things really could survive 11 years of loss and still be waiting exactly where they were left, and turned to look back out over the orchard through the low window, the crooked tree just visible in the distance. She held it out slightly, almost without meaning to, as if to show him the name written inside. "Her name was Eleanor," she said. "Your great-great-grandmother, I think, based on the dates. She wrote her name here in 1889. My father used to say she planted the first apple tree in that orchard, the crooked one, the year she was married into this house." Edward leaned in slightly to read the faded ink, close enough now that Grace could feel the warmth coming off him, close enough that the moment stretched a beat longer than either of them seemed ready to end. "I never knew that," he said, "about the tree. Nobody ever told me that story." "Nobody told you a lot of stories, it seems," Grace said. "Your family kept the house, and lost the history that came with it. Mine kept the history and lost the house. Maybe that's why it feels strange, standing here with you, instead of feeling like an enemy. We're each holding half of the same thing." Edward straightened, stepping back slightly, though something in his face had shifted, some wall she had assumed was permanent, showing the faintest crack along one edge. "What happens now?" he said. "Once the 90 days are up, once everything is officially transferred?" "I don't know yet," Grace admitted. "I spent 11 years focused entirely on getting here. I never let myself think much past the moment I'd actually be standing in this house as its owner. It felt unlucky somehow to plan too far ahead of a thing that wasn't guaranteed. And now that it is guaranteed, now I have to figure out what an entire estate actually needs from someone who spent the last decade working double jobs just to afford the legal fees to get it back," Grace said, and there was something rawer in her voice now, something she had not planned to let slip out. "I know how to fight for land. I don't know yet how to run one." "I could help," Edward said, and then seemed almost startled by his own offer, like the words had arrived before he had fully decided to say them. "Not out of guilt, or not only out of guilt. I know this house. I know the tenants, the accounts, the small maintenance problems that never make it into any official paperwork. If you wanted the help, I'd be glad to give it, even after the transfer is finalized." Grace studied him for a long moment. Behind him, afternoon light slanted through the low window he had mentioned sneaking out of as a boy, catching dust in the air, turning it gold and slow. "I'll think about it," she said. "It's a strange offer, coming from you." "Everything about the last 2 days has been strange," Edward said, "coming from either of us." Grace almost smiled at that. Almost. She held the book a little tighter instead, feeling the weight of it, the small proof that some things really could survive 11 years of loss and still be waiting exactly where they were left, and turned to look back out over the orchard through the low window, the crooked tree just visible in the distance, leaning toward the well the way it always had, long before either of them had been born into the tangled history that had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, brought them here together. Word traveled fast in the village near Ashcombe, faster than Grace expected, faster than any of the official paperwork ever could. By the 3rd week of the transition period, she could not walk into the small bakery on the corner without the woman behind the counter setting down her tongs and staring at her like she had seen a ghost stepping in out of the rain. "You're the Voss girl," the woman said, "aren't you, from the old photographs?" "I suppose I am," Grace said. "My mother used to talk about your father," the woman went on, wiping her hands on her apron, even though they were already clean. "Said it was a crime what happened to that family. Plain as anything, though nobody dared say so out loud back then. Not with the Ashcombes owning half the businesses in this village, too." Grace had not expected this. She had expected legal battles, paperwork, cold rooms full of men in suits arguing over signatures. She had not expected an entire village that remembered, quietly, for decades, a story she thought only she and her father had ever carried. "What else did your mother say?" Grace asked, and found she genuinely wanted to know. "That your father used to bring apples from that orchard down to the village fair every autumn, before everything happened. Best apples in the county, she always said. Nobody's grown apples that good from that orchard since." Grace felt something tighten in her throat, unexpected and sudden, and had to look down at the bread on the counter for a moment before she trusted her voice again. "I didn't know that," she said quietly. "He never told me that part." "Maybe he didn't want it to hurt more than it already did," the woman said, not unkindly. "Some things a person keeps to themselves, so they don't have to feel them twice." Grace left the bakery with more bread than she needed, and a strange, warm weight sitting in her chest, the rest of the walk back to the estate. She had come here prepared to reclaim a piece of land. She had not been prepared to reclaim a piece of her father as well, in fragments, from strangers who had been quietly holding pieces of him for her the entire time she was somewhere else, fighting. The trouble, when it came, arrived from a different direction entirely. Edward's cousin, a sharp-featured man named Oliver Ashcombe, arrived at the estate unannounced on a gray Thursday afternoon, driving a car too expensive for the narrow country roads and parking it crooked across the drive like he already owned the space he was standing on. "I heard what you're doing," Oliver said to Edward, ignoring Grace entirely at first. "Rolling over, handing away 2 centuries of family history because some woman turned up with a folder. The folder happens to contain proof of fraud," Edward said, his voice level in a way Grace was starting to recognize as his particular kind of anger, quiet instead of loud. I've reviewed it myself, independently. So has our own solicitor. Fraud from 50 years ago, Oliver said, long since settled by time, by use, by every reasonable legal standard that exists to protect families from exactly this kind of ambush. It's not an ambush, Grace said, stepping forward now, refusing to let him talk around her like she was a piece of furniture in the conversation. It's a correction, something your family should have made right decades ago, long before I ever had to climb a gate to get anyone's attention. Oliver turned to look at her properly for the first time, his eyes moving over her the way a person looks at something they have already decided is beneath them, and Grace felt the old familiar heat rise in her chest, the one her father used to warn her about, the one that steadied her more than it ever betrayed her. You must be very proud of yourself, Oliver said. Poor orphan girl comes back to steal the family estate. I'm not stealing anything, Grace said, her voice even and cold. I'm taking back what was stolen from my father while he was too grieving and too trusting to know he was being robbed. If that story makes your family uncomfortable, I'd suggest examining why, rather than aiming it at me. Oliver's jaw tightened. He turned back to Edward. You're really going to let this happen? Let 2 centuries of Ashcombe history dissolve because you feel guilty? I'm going to let the truth happen, Edward said. Which is a different thing than guilt, though I understand why you'd rather call it that. It's easier to dismiss guilt than to sit with the fact that our family built its comfort on someone else's ruin. You sound like her already, Oliver said, disgusted. Good, Edward said. Someone in this family should. Oliver left within the hour, tires spinning gravel as he pulled away too fast down the drive, and Grace stood beside Edward, watching the car disappear around the bend, her heart still hammering from the exchange, though something in her chest had eased slightly too, watching Edward hold his ground the way he had. He'll try to contest it, Edward said quietly, once the car was gone. Formally, he has enough money to make it annoying, even if he can't make it succeed. Let him try, Grace said. I've spent 11 years preparing for exactly this kind of fight. One angry cousin with too much free time isn't going to be the thing that stops me now. Edward looked at her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes. You didn't have to defend yourself like that, he said. I would have handled him. I know, Grace said. But I've spent enough of my life letting other people speak for me in rooms about my own family's history. I wasn't about to start again in front of your cousin. Fair enough, Edward said, and there was something almost like respect in the way he said it. Quiet and unshowy, the kind of respect that did not need an audience to prove itself real. Before any of the hearings began, there was a tenant meeting held in the old barn near the east gate. Benches arranged in rows, lanterns hung along the beams because the electricity out there had never been properly modernized. Grace stood at the front of the room, more nervous than she had been in any courtroom, facing a crowd of families whose homes depended entirely on decisions she was still learning how to make. I know change is frightening, she said, her voice carrying up into the rafters. Especially change you didn't ask for and can't control. I want to be plain with all of you. Every lease stands as it is. Every agreement your family's made with the estate remains exactly as written. The only thing changing is whose name sits on the deed, and I intend for that to matter as little to your daily lives as possible. A woman near the back raised her hand, an older woman with gray hair pulled back tight, and sharp eyes that reminded Grace faintly of the judge she had not yet met. Forgive me for asking plainly, the woman said, but why should we trust a stranger's promise over a family we've known for generations, whatever their faults? Grace had expected this question, had turned it over many times in the weeks leading up to the meeting, and still found the honest answer harder to give out loud than she expected. You shouldn't trust a stranger's promise, Grace said. You're right not to, so don't take my word alone. Ask Peter, at the Eastern Cottages, who's known my family since before I was born. Ask around the village, where plenty of people still remember exactly what happened to my father, and exactly what kind of man he was before it happened. I'm not asking you to trust a piece of paper. I'm asking you to give me the same chance to prove myself that this land already gave my grandfather and his father before him." The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Peter, sitting near the front, spoke up without being asked. "I'll vouch for her," he said simply, "for what an old man's word is worth these days." Something shifted in the room after that. A loosening, murmurs passing between neighbors, shoulders easing down from where they had been held tight and guarded. Grace felt Edward's presence somewhere behind her in the crowd, not speaking, not needing to, simply standing as a quiet kind of proof that even the family losing the estate had accepted the truth of what was happening. By the end of the meeting, most of the tension in the room had settled into something closer to cautious hope, and Grace walked out into the evening air feeling like she had passed a test far harder than any courtroom could offer her. A test that had nothing to do with paperwork and everything to do with whether ordinary people believed she deserved what she had fought so hard to win. Over the following weeks, Oliver's contest arrived exactly as predicted. A flurry of legal filings meant more to delay than to win, each one methodically taken apart by Grace's solicitor, with the same careful precision that had built the original case. Edward attended every hearing beside her, not because he was required to, but because he chose to, sitting in the gallery in a dark coat with his arms crossed, watching his own cousin's arguments crumble one by one under the weight of evidence neither of them could pretend did not exist. Grace noticed, somewhere in the middle of that stretch of hearings, that Edward had started showing up in places he did not strictly need to be, the tenant meetings, where new lease terms were explained to families who had lived on the land for generations and needed reassurance that nothing about their homes would change. The boundary survey, where men in orange vests walked the property lines with measuring equipment, while Edward stood nearby answering questions about old fences and older disputes that predated any of them. The kitchen, more than once, in the early evening, when Grace was the only other person in it, making tea she did not particularly want, just to have something to do with her hands. "You don't have to keep showing up to all of this," she told him one evening, the two of them standing at the kitchen counter while rain traced slow lines down the window above the sink. "I know," Edward said. "Then why do you—" He considered the question longer than she expected, the kettle behind him beginning to hiss toward a boil neither of them moved to stop. "Because for the first time in my life, I feel useful in a way that has nothing to do with what I was born into," he said, "helping with the tenants, the boundaries, the small daily problems of running an estate properly instead of simply inheriting the comfort of one. It turns out I like it. I didn't expect to." Grace turned that answer over in her mind, feeling the shape of something underneath it she did not quite want to name yet, something that had nothing to do with land or deeds or 11 years of legal fighting. "My father used to say, 'The land remembers who takes care of it,'" she said instead, "safer ground. Regardless of whose name is on the paperwork. Then perhaps the land has decided we're both worth remembering," Edward said, and the kettle finally screamed behind him, and neither of them moved to answer it for a moment longer than either of them could quite explain. The rain kept tracing its slow lines down the window. Somewhere out past the orchard, the crooked apple tree stood bare in the evening light, waiting, the way it had waited through 50 years of a stolen history, for something in its shape to finally come right again. The final hearing took place on a bright morning in a courtroom too small for the weight of what was being decided inside it. Grace sat beside her solicitor, hands folded tight in her lap, while Oliver's lawyer made one last attempt at an argument everyone in the room already knew was going to fail. "The claim rests entirely on documents decades old," the lawyer said. "Memory is unreliable. Records degrade. We ask the court to consider the practical chaos of unwinding 50 years of established ownership over a dispute this old." The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes and very little patience for theater, looked over her glasses at the folder in front of her. "I've reviewed the forensic document analysis," she said, "the bank records, the witness statements. This is not a case built on faded memory, counsel. This is a case built on a fraud so clearly documented that I am frankly surprised it took this long for someone to bring it before a court." She turned to Grace. Miss Voss, the court finds in your favor. Full and clear title to the Ashcombe estate is restored to the Voss family, effective immediately. The original 1974 transfer is voided as fraudulent. Grace sat very still. She had imagined this moment so many times over 11 years that she thought she had already used up every possible reaction to it in her head. She found, sitting there in the small bright courtroom, that she had not. Something loosened in her chest, slow and total, like a knot finally worked free after being pulled tight for over a decade. Beside her, Edward let out a breath she had not realized he was holding either. Outside the courthouse the morning was warm and clear, and Grace stood on the steps for a long moment, letting it settle over her. Oliver brushed past without a word, his face tight with a loss he would probably spend years being bitter about. Edward stayed. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Finally having it. Officially. No more hearings. No more appeals." Grace thought about the question honestly before she answered it. "Strange," she said. "I expected relief. And there is relief, somewhere underneath everything else. But mostly I feel tired. 11 years of tired, all catching up to me at once, now that there's nothing left to fight for." "Grief does that too," Edward said quietly. "Arrives late, once the urgent thing is finally settled, and there's room for it to land." Grace looked at him, surprised again by how easily he seemed to understand the shape of things she had not fully put into words herself. They drove back to the estate together, in a silence that did not feel heavy, the countryside sliding by in the same green stretches it always had, except now, for the first time, none of it belonged to anyone but her. The gate at the entrance stood open, the lock finally removed the week before, and Grace walked up the long gravel drive slower than she had the first time, letting herself actually see the place instead of rushing through it toward a confrontation. She stopped where she had stood on that very first morning, at the bottom of the front steps, her hand resting on the same brass handle, worn smooth by generations of hands that had come before hers and would come after. "What will you do with it now?" Edward asked, standing a few steps behind her. "Now that it's actually yours, and not just a wound with a deed attached to it." Grace turned to look at him. The question sat there between them, bigger than either of them seemed ready to answer fully. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "I know I want the tenants to stay, exactly as promised. I know I want to replant that orchard properly, bring in someone who actually understands how to save frost-damaged trees instead of losing more of them. I know I want to put Eleanor's book back on that shelf where it belongs, instead of keeping it locked away somewhere safe and useless. And beyond that," Grace considered the house in front of her, really looked at it, the pale stone, the ivy creeping up one side, the windows catching the morning light in long gold streaks. She thought about her father, describing this exact view from a hospital bed 2 counties away, never once getting to see it again with his own eyes. She thought about 11 years of double shifts and legal fees and locked gates she had to climb over, just to stand where she was standing now. "I think," she said slowly, "I want to figure out how to actually live here, instead of just winning it." Those turned out to be 2 very different things. "They usually are," Edward said. "What about you?" Grace asked. "What happens to you now, once the estate isn't yours anymore?" Edward was quiet for a moment, considering the question the same careful way he seemed to consider everything. "I don't know that either," he admitted. "I've spent my whole life being the future of something that turns out was never rightfully mine to inherit. I suppose I have some rebuilding of my own to do, figuring out who I am when I'm not simply the next Ashcombe waiting to take over a house that was never fully honest about how it came to exist." "You could stay," Grace said, before she had fully decided to say it. "Help, the way you offered. If you wanted to." Edward looked at her, something careful and hopeful moving behind his expression at the same time, the 2 things sitting together in a way that made Grace's chest tighten pleasantly instead of painfully, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember. "I'd like that," he said, "if you're certain it's what you want, and not simply an old habit of generosity you inherited from a father who gave away apples at the village fair every autumn." Grace almost laughed at that, surprised again by how easily he had learned to read her, how quickly the 11 years of armor she had built around herself had started, quietly, to soften around the edges whenever he was near. "I'm certain," she said, "though I make no promises about how complicated it might get, two families with this much history standing this close together every day. I've never been afraid of complicated," Edward said, "only of pretending things were simpler than they actually were. I'd rather have complicated and honest, if it's all the same to you." Grace turned back to look at the house, at the door she had touched that very first morning, warmer than she expected under her palm, and pushed it open properly for the first time, stepping over the threshold into a front hall she had heard described in bedtime stories 1,000 times before she ever got to see it with her own eyes. It was smaller than the stories, and larger too, in all the ways that mattered. Behind her, she heard Edward's footsteps follow her in, unhurried, patient, the way a man walks when he has finally decided what kind of life he wants to build, instead of simply inheriting one. Grace stood in the front hall of the house that was finally, fully, undeniably hers, and let herself feel, for the first time in 11 years, that the fight was over, and something else, something she had not planned for and could not yet name, was only just beginning. That evening Grace walked out to the orchard alone, leaving Edward back at the house sorting through old ledgers, with a patience she was beginning to rely on more than she wanted to admit. The crooked tree stood exactly where it always had, leaning toward the well the way Eleanor had apparently planted it to lean, and Grace pressed her palm flat against its bark, feeling the rough grain of it under her hand. "We made it," she said quietly, to nobody, to her father, to the tree, to whoever might still be listening after all these years. "I don't know if you can hear this. I like to think you can. I brought it home." The evening wind moved through the branches, soft and unhurried, and somewhere behind her she heard footsteps on the grass, Edward approaching slowly, giving her the space to finish whatever private conversation she was having before he arrived close enough to interrupt it. "I found something," he said, once he reached her, holding out an old ledger page, brittle at the edges. "Records from the year the orchard was first planted. Your family's name is on it, clear as anything, right alongside my own. Seems the two families were tangled together in this land long before either of us arrived to sort out the mess of it." Grace took the page carefully, reading the faded handwriting by the last of the evening light, feeling something settle in her chest that had nothing left in it of anger, only a strange, wide sense of continuity, of standing at the end of a very long story that had somehow, despite everything, found its way back to something like fairness. "What do we do with a history like that?" she asked. "One that refuses to stay separated no matter how hard either family tried." "I suppose we stop trying to separate it," Edward said, "and see what grows instead, if we let it." Grace looked at him in the fading light, at the orchard around them, at the crooked tree still leaning patiently toward water it had been reaching for longer than either of their families had been arguing over who owned the ground it grew in, and found herself, for the first time in 11 years, thinking less about what had been taken from her and more about what might still be built. The land, after everything, had remembered exactly who it belonged to. What it would become next was still hers to decide, and for the first time, she found she was not deciding it alone.